what I did is I took, well, let me, one of the things that often happens is that students and faculty share some common neuromyths that are really popular in our society. And we're going to talk about those. The source of all of these is a study that was done by Michelle Miller and several other people, where they did a survey of thousands of people, thousands of educators, instructional designers, and administrators to find how prevalent certain neuromyths were. Well, it's actually a combination. It's a little mislabeled. The first ones we'll look at are neuromyths. The others are basically myths about evidence-based teaching, or what we've discovered about teaching practices. So it's really a myth, a combination of neuromyths and myths about teaching practices. And this is the original study, which is very long, but I'm going to copy the link address and I'll drop it into chat. It's a really well done study. I was at a couple of sessions where Michelle presented this, along with a couple of her co-authors at the Online Learning Consortium. And there's a link to it. Okay, but in any case, one of the myths, and this is one you've probably seen at some point or another, it probably doesn't affect instruction directly, but it's just a really common one. And that is that listening to classical music increases reasoning ability. You may have also seen variants of this where it helps plants grow faster and such things. But the argument is that if children or college students listen to classical music, they're going to be more productive. And basically, research suggests that there's no basis to that. However, in a survey of faculty, 85% of faculty answered that incorrectly. What the research does show is that listening to music for some students increases their ability to concentrate and focus by drowning out other sounds. And for other students, it tends to be distracting, and there's no net positive effect on average, but some people benefit, some don't. Students who listen to music that do not have words, that are purely instrumental, sometimes benefit from that. Others still end up focusing on that rather than what they're trying to learn. And it really doesn't seem to make much of a difference on average. White noise can be helpful if you're in a noisy environment with distraction, but really there's no evidence that classical music increases your reasoning ability, although I suppose some musicians or classical musicians that might prefer to believe this. And another common misperception is that or neuromyth is that a primary indicator of dyslexia is seeing letters backwards, where letters are reversed and such things. And in fact, that is also false, but it is believed by 77% of the faculty surveyed. Dyslexia is basically an issue that involves challenges processing written information, encoding printed text and so forth, converting words into text and text into words. So it's a more general form of processing that does not necessarily involve seeing letters backwards or reversing the order. Sometimes orders do seem to be reversed in pronunciation, but it's more just a difficulty in converting printed words to sound, and it has no relationship at all to overall intelligence or other types of mental processing. So it's not all that uncommon among academia, people in academia, and it really seems to bear no significant relationship to how people learn, but it can result in challenges for students who experience it in terms of being able to read content or in terms of being able to write effectively. And there are some nice aids to that. Certainly text readers can be helpful in dealing with processing of written text, because in general, people who have trouble processing written text do not have the same challenges processing things they hear. So, that could be a bit of a barrier, or sometimes dyslexia is seen as a more general problem than it actually is. Now, this is one which I've been amazed at the persistence of this. Well, and basically the argument is individuals learn better when they receive information in their preferred learning style. And the most commonly cited ones, although there's hundreds of classifications out there from various groups trying to make money selling their tests, are auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, the AVK types of learning styles. And basically, every single study that's ever been done on this for at least the last 30 or 40 years indicates that that's false, that there are benefits of seeing things in multiple ways, to watching videos, to reading materials, to seeing examples, doing hands-on work and so forth. But that does not differ in any way across people with different learning styles. That people who are classified as being auditory learners do no better nor no worse than other students in processing auditory information. Students who are auditory learners do not do better or worse than students who, when they receive information through visual learners, through visual techniques. Basically, we all benefit from seeing concepts in multiple ways because it provides multiple connections. And, so one thing about this myth that is incredibly pervasive, and in fact, it's believed by 74% of faculty and a little bit more, a larger proportion actually of administrators, and roughly the same proportion of instructional designers, is that it encourages people to use multimodal instruction, to provide instruction using imagery, using text, using recordings, using videos, and so forth, and that benefits everyone. The problem with this is that quite often the same people who believe in learning styles will test students to measure their learning style. And you have students coming to you in college classes, and I have this every semester, and sometimes they've been tested here on campus, which is extremely troubling because, we've done so many workshops, hundreds of workshops that have debunked this, but unfortunately the people who believe in this tend not to attend workshops. But in any case, we have students who are tested, they're told typically that they're visual learners, and as a result, they can't learn from reading a textbook or reading a document or reading an essay. And it serves as a barrier to those students. It's essentially it creates a fixed mindset that they're not able to learn in this way, when in fact, there's no difference in their ability to learn in this way compared to any other technique. So it's really damaging to students, and I wish people would just stop it. It's even more pervasive when we look at K through 12 instructors. Something like 85 to 90% of them believe in this. And that's partly because they regularly waste money and resources and time testing students. And many of the students who told me this have said, well, I've been tested 4 or 5 times, including just last year. And I'm a visual learner, and I don't believe this research. And it can be really damaging, because really, we don't want students to restrict their perceptions of how they can learn. But again, to the extent to which it encourages multimodal instruction, a belief in this isn't harmful, but to the extent to which it encourages students to believe that they're not capable in learning in other ways, it serves as a barrier to learning, and it can encourage, fixed mindsets, which we know does serve as a barrier to learning. A really common type of misperception, and you hear this all the time from students and from faculty and many others, is that I'm left brain, I can't do this type of thing, or I'm right brain. And as a result, that affects what people can learn. The notion is that left brain people are more creative and right brain people have more cognitive processing power or something similar. There is absolutely no basis to that. And yet 72% of faculty believe that people are either left-brained or right-brained. And again, it has the same sort of problem associated with the learning styles myth. And it would be nice if we could get past that. Another thing that people often say is we only use 10% of our brain. And this actually did come about from some studies with some early MRIs that were used, because was it MRIs or measures, yeah, I think it was MRIs, where when people were measuring brain activity, they just weren't very sensitive initially. And they were only able to detect brain activity in a small portion of the brain. And it was basically due to an equipment issue rather than actual the amount of our brain that's in use. That in general, all of our brain is in use 24 hours a day, whether we're awake or we're sleeping. And it's just, this myth probably doesn't do a lot of harm because in a sense, it does suggest that we have some more capacity. On the other hand, this isn't in a specific study that I'm citing throughout this, but some people believe that their brains are full and they can't put anything more in. And yet there really doesn't seem to be a barrier to how much we can learn. Not because we have 90% of our brains being empty and unused, but because, you know, we need to work on making more connections, and it can become challenging, and age may have a factor in that, or at least that's my excuse sometimes. But in any case, another question that was asked in the study of myths was whether learning is due to modification in the brain. And that is in fact true, that whenever you learn something, there are changes in your brain structure. And 33% of faculty answered this incorrectly. So faculty were much better about recognizing this. One of the things I think that may have helped a little bit was that book that referred to, what was it? That looked at Google, and The Shallows was part of the title. Anyone remember the title? We had a faculty member present on this at a workshop early on, and it was interesting. Basically, it was suggesting that Google was damaging our brains because it was causing, on the internet and so forth, was changing our brains and so forth.
What the internet is doing to our brains.
Oh yeah, what the internet is doing to our brains, the shallows. Yeah, and basically the concern was that when students were using the internet and viewing things on the internet and so forth and using Google, it was changing their brain structures. But so does reading a book, so does thinking about something, so do your life experiences. So, you know, when we learn, we're really changing the structures of our brain. And a follow-up question related to this, that learning is due to, this is kind of the same question rephrased, learning is in fact due to modifications in the brain, and some low proportion of faculty got that. Now, those were the neuromyths that were addressed in that study that was done by the Online Learning Consortium with a very large sample of participants. But when we switch to then some of the questions related to evidence-based practices. And one of those is rereading course materials is an effective strategy for learning. And this is false based on pretty much every study I've seen, and lots of them have come out of that group at Washington who were responsible for the Make It Stick book. And 74% of faculty perceive this as being as a true statement, that and encourage students that if they don't understand something to reread it. And what most of the research suggests is that a second reading of material can lead to an increase in learning. But beyond that, there's no, in all the studies I've looked at to date at least, there is no significant difference when you read something within a given period of time, within a month or so, when you reread it a second time. And you know, by encouraging students to repeatedly reread, they run into this issue of fluency illusion, that by rereading something, everything looks familiar. All the words on the page now look like words they've seen before. The images are there in the same places. The graphs are there, the charts are there, and it all seems to make a lot of sense. But that's not really learning. It's again, this phenomenon known as fluency illusion. A related point is that, and this was again one of the statements that they used in that study, that testing in general tends to detract from learning. This is one of the earliest things that was learned about learning. The testing effect goes back to the late 1800s or early 1900s. I forgot the exact date. And basically it's been shown that the more you're tested on material, the deeper you learn it. And being tested repeatedly has much more an effect on learning than trying to store that information repeatedly. Most generally, this is now, we tend not to call it the testing effect, that generally it's referred to as retrieval practice. And what research suggests basically is the more you practice retrieving information, the better you are at being able to retrieve information in the future. So again, repeatedly storing information in your brain really doesn't do much good in terms of improved short-term or long-term. Well, in short-term recall benefits, but in terms of long-term recall, it has very little benefit. But repeated attempts to retrieve information does provide benefit. And in particular, you get the most powerful effect from retrieval when you try doing it right at the point where you're on the verge of forgetting that information. And 46% of faculty answered incorrectly. So this was better. So, there has been some improvement in this, because often people look down on testing as being damaging, or retrieval practice in general as not being that useful, but it is an important foundation for learning. Now, another statement that was given is with respect to memory. Massed instruction is superior to spaced instruction. So having extended periods of exposure, having long classes, working. For example, one of the ways of doing this would be to have a 3-week class, let's say, or something similar during a winter session or during a short summer session, is superior to space instruction. And the evidence on this is really strong that that is false, that the more we space instruction, the more we space our studying, the longer we tend to retrieve things, or the better we are at retrieving things in the future. Long-term recall is enhanced substantially by spacing out study sessions and so forth. There was in the text that I shared, and let me put that link back in. They cite all the sources for this information. And
you want me to redo it? The one you are?
yeah, I got it.
Oh,
So yeah, this was the study that Michelle Miller and Kristen Betts and a number of other people did, where they looked at how many people answered these questions. And in this case, 42% of faculty answered that incorrectly. So again, a majority of faculty did believe that spacing was effective, but again, a large proportion of faculty do not. Another thing, this was a statement that they used in the survey, that human memory works much like a digital recording device or video camera, in that it accurately records the events we have experienced. And there's certainly been enough studies out there to indicate that this is far from accurate. And most faculty have recognized this, that only 30% of faculty do believe in this myth. And certainly evidence from eyewitness testimony or various studies asking people, for example, if people who had visited Disney World, if they had seen Donald Duck at Disney World and so forth, and they will talk about how they've seen it, and they'll often have memories of things that just would not have happened, because Donald Duck not Donald Duck, Daffy Duck. No, who was the Looney Tunes? I'm sorry. The Looney Tunes.
Tweety Bird or Tweety?
Well, it was one of the
one of the
Hanna-Barbera characters, I forgot. And a remarkably large proportion of people do recall things that just couldn't have happened. And if you ask people to recall events, let's say siblings to recall events earlier in their history, the versions of those events will often differ quite a bit based on how their memories have been shaped over time, or how their perspectives have been shaped over time. Okay, here's another one, that decorative graphics can enhance learning when applied to course materials. And what the research suggests is that is true. And the percent of faculty who answered that incorrectly was only 22%. So decorative graphics and more generally imagery can enhance learning. In some cases, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. And that's even more true. It's even more likely to be the case when the graphics are tied to the concept, and so on. Oh, Daffy Duck. Okay, it was Daffy Duck.
Yeah.
So people have been asked about that, and they often get it wrong. I forgot what proportions, but there's numerous examples of how memory is malleable. And that's really all I had. I thought there was a bit more, but these were the ones that were most common in studies. And any thoughts or any other neuromyths or myths that are out there that you'd like to comment on? Anyone? I'm going to stop the sharing now.
I was just gonna say, John, like even in the beginning when you started with the classical music and then with dyslexia, I was just thinking, because I teach sexual health in the media for my 198 course, and just those two slides, I think back to like, you know, where I thought of these myths, and it was from the media. Like I've seen it in movies, you know, seeing pregnant women playing classical music for their newborn babies, or, you know, dyslexia in movies where it's, you know, the words are backwards, and those, you know, the media, also the social aspect of what we see in films and movies and what's portrayed, we see these myths a lot as well. So I think when I saw some of them, I was like, oh yeah, I would have gotten that wrong too, because I continuously see these messages, you know, that are incorrect, which I think probably our students do too. Yeah.
And again, it would be more generally, one of the issues is most students haven't really ever been taught how to learn.
Right.
And we don't really, I know you were doing a lot of it in your role, but you know, in general, most college students are never taught about effective learning strategies. They've been exposed to practices through K through 12 that are not consistent with increasing memory, increasing the ability to recall, or increasing transferability. And without that training, students are going to keep doing things the same way as they've done before, and they're wasting a tremendous amount of time. And if we could encourage students to use their time more efficiently, they're going to be more successful. And I wish that we were doing more of that somewhere here at college, because and as you can see in some of the numbers, especially the early things, most faculty believe in some of these learning myths too, and they're often encouraging students to use practices like highlighting or repeated rereading that are demonstrably not particularly effective. And we rely on high stakes exams, and many classes are high stakes assessments, which just encourages students to use, you know, to cram for exams, which does not help the ability to remember things long term.
What are other suggestions, John, like with, or implementations for our classes, even upper division level? I'm thinking of our students. So like retrieval practices, I do like mastery quizzes. So like other implementations we can add in our classes to help with little.
Certainly, mastery quizzing is a really effective way of doing this. One problem that has happened, though, is its effectiveness has been diminished a bit because of things like Chegg and ChatGPT, because I used to see with retrieval practice quizzes dramatic increases in student learning, and that's broken down over time as it's become easy for students just to look up answers, and pretty much any questions that are out there, you know, if you're using multiple choice or, you know, or fill in the blank, or even algorithmic questions, students are able to get responses really quickly without having to do the processing with online quizzing, and that's a real challenge out there. But for those students who use it, and those students, you know, if you can convince students that they're much better off learning the material, so that when they have assessments where they don't have access to those tools, such as in-class exams and so on, if we can encourage students to do that, it would be helpful. But again, a lot of studies of students, including some at our SUNY college, fellow SUNY campuses, suggests that up to 90–95% of students do use these online academic integrity violation services, at least occasionally in their education. But again, it's a really useful tool, but we have to convince students it's much better if they do it on their own. Keeping it low stakes or no stakes is one way of doing it. On the other hand, in general, when things are no stakes, students often don't do them.
Yeah.
And the students who are least likely to do them are the students who generally would benefit the most from using them. I used to make those quizzes no stakes, and I found that the only students who were doing those were students who were at the borderline between an A and an A minus, where they were worried that their grade might drop to an A minus, while the students who were struggling the most tended not to do those things. So making them low stakes, keeping only the highest grade is a good way of encouraging all students to do it. But that's a good practice. What are some other ones that anyone has tried to encourage people to move away from cramming and block practice and such things?
I guess not every student is in a place where they're ready to hear that, like changing their study strategies might help. Like sometimes there's so much like anxiety where they feel like they have to do it this way and spend all this time on it. But I think the times when it maybe has been better received is like, they're not happy with how they're doing, but they have some goal that they're trying to reach. So sometimes I would show students on academic probation, like, if they had said like they wanted to go to medical school or something like that, I would show them these videos made by a Stanford professor that's like how to study in medical school. And they would talk about these, space practice and retrieval practice strategies. And so I would talk to students about like, if there's stuff that you need to commit to memory because it's really important and that, you need to know it for future classes or your career, like this is a method you can use for that long-term learning. And, while you may not necessarily you may not choose to study this way for every class, if it's stuff that, you need to build on, like sequential, that this can really help you learn it effectively.
And in chat, Kristen shared a link to some work that Stephen Chu has done, which might be the same person at Samford University, on some student-facing work. The learning scientists also have a lot of really nice summaries and videos and podcasts and infographics that are aimed towards students that we can share with students to help them. And yeah, making students see the relevance of their learning is really important. And that's broken down a bit, I think, in the last few years, that students, or at least in my experience, students are more likely to see that a degree that matters rather than necessarily the learning. And to the extent to which we can help students recognize that they're learning some useful skills and we can tie those skills to their future career plans, the better their motivation would be to actually focus on learning rather than taking shortcuts that may help their grades, but in the short run, but won't help them come out better prepared for the rest of their lives. We could move away from high stakes exams, and have more low stakes activities. We can do more scaffolding and provide more feedback to students. We could design our courses that encouraging space practice. We can build interleave practice into our courses by having perhaps progressively cumulative exams, so that instead of just having a few high stakes exams, you have students being questions about things from earlier portions of their class as you move forward, so that you're building into your structure space practice and interleave practice, as well as instead of having students just cram for an exam and then forget that material and go on to the next, because they don't really have much incentive to work on it beyond the exam if they know they're not going to be tested on it. Other strategies. Anyone?
I mean, explaining things aloud to a classmate is something that I think students connect with, so I'll talk to them about why that's effective. And the other nice thing about it is like they can have company. Like it's not always, like fun to sit there and like study by yourself, but it can be a little more enjoyable if you have like a partner to do it with.
That was something also that was emphasized by, who was it? The person who did the book, who emphasized metacognition, one of our reading groups, teaching students how to learn, or teach students how to learn.
Sandra McGuire.
Yes, Sandra
Yeah.
McGuire. She emphasized that as one of the tactics, encouraging students to work on explaining things to their peers.
Yeah.
Explain it to your roommate, explain it to your significant other. If that you don't feel comfortable doing that, she suggested explaining it to a goldfish, or explaining it to your parents, or something similar. There was a study that just came out actually that suggested that for students who felt uncomfortable explaining things to someone else, that recording a video and watching the video later, can help reinforce it without doing that any further, anything beyond that. So recording a video where no one else is listening actually seemed to have a significant improvement on performance, rather than trying to explain it to other people, because explaining things to other people led to a little bit more anxiety for many students, or at least the students who were struggling a bit. And so I only saw a reference to that early this morning on Twitter. It was posted. I forgot who posted it, but I have downloaded the paper, and I'll look at it more carefully. But it does suggest that that type of practice is real. Well, we've known that type of practice is helpful, because if you can explain something to someone else, you understand it fairly well, and the act of trying to explain it reinforces that learning. And peer instruction is another really good technique of doing that. So if you're teaching classes where you're using clickers, having students vote individually, but then having them discuss it and debate it. All those small group activities and cooperative learning activities involve peer instruction, and that students are regularly explaining things to each other, which is a really good way of using retrieval practice and developing those deeper understanding. Other strategies.
I have a question to put out there. So for the students who are just like so anxious about their performance, and they want to cling to the strategies that they thought worked for them, even when like you try to like help them see that if you spend time using this more efficient strategy, you can spend less time studying, and then you can do like other fun things that are actually like good for your mental health and cognitive functioning, like time with friends, or like time to exercise. Like some of them just like it is a really hard sell, and I was just wondering if anybody has any suggestions that have worked with students.
It's really hard to change behavior for any of us, but one thing I've used that seems to help a little bit is I've done low stakes discussion forums where they'll read something about that. And then what will happen is other people say, I heard about this and I tried it and it helped. And when they hear from peers who say that this strategy was helpful, and in almost any of these techniques, Pomodoro techniques, or spacing their practice, or getting more sleep before exams, those types of things, when they hear their fellow students saying, I wasn't convinced about this, but I tried it and it helped, that can make a huge difference. But that may be hard to get in a freshman level course, or if you're working with students who are relatively new.
We did have conversations like that in the EDU 104 academic success course, where students would recommend like the counseling center to each other, or like, apps like for time management or studying or something. So yes, it is helpful for them to hear from peers. Yeah.
Any other suggestions on how to convince students to change behaviors? And there's a lot of research going on right now in terms of behavior change, more broadly, and not just in academia. And there's a lot of things that will work in the short term, but getting longer term changes are a bit tougher. There was a big NSF grant that came out a couple of years ago with a group of people working on it. some Katie Milkman was one of the principal investigators, and who else? I'm trying to remember. Well, there were about a dozen people, but they were some pretty well-known behavioral economists and psychologists who were working on this project. And they found it challenging to induce behavior change, especially with patterns of behavior that have been incentivized and ingrained for a long period of time.
So the piece that I would add is that I know, John, you talk a lot, frequently, about breaking up things into smaller pieces and spreading things much more meaningfully over the semester, including giving students explicit guidance at each step of the way about what, how is this assignment, or how is this project, or how is this preparation for this test structured in a way so that successful student behaviors are a required component. So I think it's less about talking students into successful study strategies. I think it's more about structuring the preparation so that successful study strategies are part of the preparation. So things like spaced practice is built in through multiple low stakes assignments. Self-testing can be built into class through retrieval practice activities with peers. So there's no, I don't know. I don't usually find it very helpful to talk people into anything. Anybody, they do what they have done in the past, no matter what kind of convincing you try and do. But if you structure it so that different behavior happens, then you don't have to worry about whether or not you've talked them into a more successful strategy or not.
One of the problems,
I'll just add also that our conscious experience of motivation and willpower is not that strongly related to our actual motivation and willpower. So getting people to do what is good for them, getting students to learn and practice in a way that is good for learning, can kind of jump over the piece where they say, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know. Yeah, well, let's just do it. Let's just do it and see what happens. We don't have to convince. Let's just do it.
And that would be easiest if we could get all faculty to move in that direction, which is one of the reasons why we're trying the small teaching reading group again. One of the things we were talking about before this session actually was one of the things that Jessamine Newhouse has been doing at Plattsburgh is getting one person from each department to participate in an activity where they're introducing some evidence-based teaching method, sharing it with their colleagues and bringing it back to these discussions. And if we could do something like that, if we could find some way,
that's a good idea.
All the departments, maybe combined with the reading group, maybe we could get one department, each department to send someone to participate in the reading group and take it back to departments. That could make a big difference. Because one of the things I've noticed with the reading groups is they've been great. We've had lots of great discussions, but it is often the same people year to year in the reading groups. And we've got a lot of people who just haven't participated, and a lot of whole departments that have little or no participation. And if we could get some inroads there to spread these practices so that, if space practice, if retrieval practice is built into course design, students wouldn't have to change behavior. And perhaps they might be convinced that this is a bit more effective. The part of the problem, though, is every study I've also seen suggests that students believe that these strategies are less effective because they're getting immediate feedback that can indicate that they don't understand things that well. In a lecture class where they just sit there and they nod and everything seems reasonable, they don't have to do as much processing. It seems easier. It seems
so reassuring. It just feels so warm and cuddly,
And they feel that they've learned more, despite every study finding that is less effective at learning. So the problem is what feels better or feels more effective to students are not the practices that are most effective. And that provides an incentive to faculty to not necessarily move in the direction of evidence-based practices because it could harm their course evaluations. It could cause students to rate their courses a bit lower and to complain that, they have to do more of the learning themselves, perhaps, which is a not uncommon response that anyone using these practices tends to get. And
I just love that. And every time you talk about that, I immediately start jumping to all the analogies in my own life and in the life of adults that are not students. Like, what are all the things that I'm doing that feel just like I'm really doing the thing and I'm not doing the thing? Like, I'm actually relaxing. No, I'm just pretending to relax right now. Not getting the benefits of relaxation out of this activity. But I think your idea is great, and I'm going to follow up with you by email.
okay.
Let's see. Let's take it to Dean's Council and talk together about it.
That would be great. And one of the things they did, what Jessamine talked about that a little bit in the session yesterday, either before or after, maybe even during the session, is they have, I think she just calls them departmental representatives, and they get a certificate in a ceremony that was delivered by the president. And they also, their departments got a token $100 for inclusive teaching materials or something like that, that could be used to support it. I don't know if that would be necessary, and it seems kind of small, but the certificate and the recognition of their work might be valued, because with AQ, that's really all that people are getting. They're doing a tremendous amount of work and a very beneficial and useful work. And basically they end up with a certificate, and the feeling that they now can be more effective. But, it doesn't,
but it's a way
the
to
recognition can have some value in itself.
And it's a way to kind of get people, new people maybe to be a part of things.
Because that's, I think, one of the goals for the center should be to reach out, because we've talked about this before, but we're not reaching that many people. We've had pretty good attendance, a little bit less so at this time because I think people are a little tired and burnt out. But we have pretty good attendance, but there's a lot of people that we're not reaching. And I think that should be the focus, getting to some other people and trying to spread some of these practices further. And we do have a lot of people in AQ who might help spread these informally, but if we had some mechanism to reach out, perhaps to a more formal structure, it might help.
Absolutely. I love it. Great idea.
One thing I do tell my students, I talk about these strategies in my large class, and I encourage them to work with other people, to explain things to each other, to work through some of the low stakes activities together and to explain things in that process. And I talk about commitment devices and how having that sort of commitment to their peers can make a big difference. Not many students do that though. And, I do encourage them to meet the people around them, even when the large class say, you're going to be sitting next to the same people pretty much all the time, because very few people change your seats after the first day or so. So get to know the people around you and talk to them and try to find some times when you might get together and work on it. And, the people who do that do much better because they agree to meet at a certain time, maybe once or twice or 3 times a week. And I've often seen them in the library, sometimes to the room across the hall, sometimes down in, the 24-hour room. And when they have questions, if they get stuck on something, they just wander down. That was much more common though before the pandemic than now. They're not forming the same connections, or at least I didn't see them forming the same connections in the same way as before. Any other suggestions on how to get people, if for a student's perspective, getting them to use these practices would be really helpful if we don't have faculty making changes that encourage these practices. I mean, the best strategy would be, the first best solution would be to have faculty build this into their teaching. But that's still not quite happening in many classes or most classes from what I've seen.
The tutors in the tutoring center can model some of these strategies, and students, when they come to tutoring, they are like at a place where they're looking for help. So it's like, a moment where they might be willing to like possibly try something different. If the tutor suggested, as you mentioned, when they hear from peers, they're more likely to try it. So.
And one thing that you've probably all seen the Chronicle and the Chronicle or the Inside Higher Ed articles about that study that was done by Michael Newlander and another person, where they sent out emails to students who were experiencing difficulties. And it was initially in large economic classes, but then they spread it to a wide variety of disciplines. And it led to a significant increase in student grades and in student success and student persistence in the institution. And doing that in just one class had a significant effect on student retention and student GPA 4 years later, because they followed that initial wave forward. And that's something that could be easily done in Brightspace. In fact, I did a workshop on that last week, where we can set up simple automated emails to students when their grades fall below a certain threshold, and encourage them to meet with you and encourage them to use some of the resources that you've provided in the course. And if you do that early, you can make some connections in ways that, might not happen otherwise. So, and encouraging students to use tutoring as well. And again, that can be automated, so it's not necessarily creating more work for the instructor, and perhaps until responses come in, but it's a whole lot easier to deal with student challenges at the first 3 or 4 weeks of the semester than in the last week, when you're most likely to hear from the students who are struggling. So
I have another idea, maybe for Dean's Council. I was just talking with Casey Town this morning. She's the Associate Director of OLS. A professor asked, instead of having an OLS staff person come to their class, could they bring their class to the tutoring center for a tour? And Casey's going to add that to our list of offerings that we have. People can indicate that they want to set up a tour of OLS. We found when we visit classrooms, go to a classroom presentation, we get kind of 3 new students coming to use the tutoring center out of that class. And when they come and see how welcoming it is, and the light and the space and the fish tank and the the hot beverage bar that's available with coffee, tea, hot chocolate, then they want to come back. So we were talking this morning, and Casey's going to put an announcement on Oswego today that we're going to start making that as an option. So if you bring a whole class to come see the tutoring center, imagine how many of those students would perhaps start using it. So
yeah, it's a great idea.
Breaking that initial barrier is huge. I had one student who was struggling, and his girlfriend talked him into coming over, because they were always sitting next to each other, and they were talking at the end of class, where he wasn't doing that well. It was about 4 weeks in, and she literally dragged him over to my office. And from then on, he was coming in 3 or 4 times a week. In fact, for the next 4 years. But getting that initial barrier of going in and talking to someone, going to the tutoring center or talking to faculty members, it's a tough barrier for students, because in their high school experiences, when they're called in to talk to somebody, it often is not a good thing. And getting them comfortable doing that can be really helpful. I don't think I'd bring in my whole class of 300 or 400 students.
But you can have a little stamp or whatever. And they could visit and get their stamp.
Send them on a scavenger hunt.
Any other suggestions? I thought I had more than that short little presentation, but I haven't talked about these things in this way in a while. Most of the things have been talked about here or there, but
Oh, I know it's not on their list, but at least I don't think it's on their list, that your brain is your most important muscle.
yeah.
That's one of my favorites, because it ends up with really people will make jumps from that and end up with some really strange misconceptions about like how your body works. Like no, it's actually not. It's
Yeah,
super important, but
but it's not a muscle, and making
it is
an
not a muscle. It doesn't
muscle-
work that way.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, when sometimes when talking to students, if you talk to them about like, because a lot of them, I see a lot of students in the gym, and it does seem to be important to students. Like if you talk to them about how in order to make your muscles grow, you do have to put in enough effort to do it. So if it's too easy, like you're not going to get the gains that you're looking for. So learning works the same way. You can't just do things that are easy. You on purpose have to do things that are hard, and they're used to doing that in the gym if they know what they're doing. So
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
And it's a
Yeah.
good way of encouraging, that
Yeah.
metaphor is a good way of encouraging a growth mindset, that you have to practice things to get better at them.
yeah.
Just don't call it a
Yeah,
muscle.
no. Definitely do not do that.
Because I've seen people make that analogy
Yeah.
and say, it's just like any other muscle. Sometimes they'll even say that you have to work at it to get it stronger, but yeah. Oh, and by the way, we do have a podcast with Mikhail Newberger. We'll be talking about that thing. We recorded it yesterday, 2 days ago, sometime recently. So,
Good. Thank you.
okay, well, I guess that's it then. Thanks for coming, and
Thank you, everyone.
we're almost done.
Yeah.
Very
Thank you.
nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see all of you.
Good seeing you.
You
Thank
too.
you.
Eat now.